So you can see that I'm recording this, and I hope that everything is working fine with my new setup in here, but I'll be posting this on YouTube later today. So our first lesson, like I said, is going to be a bit about DNA, a bit about chromosomes, and this word that you've probably never heard before, karyotype. Has anyone ever heard the word karyotype before? All right, so we're all learning something new today. Well, not me. I know what it is. So there's a picture here only because I like to have you be able to see what I'm talking about. You do not need to be able to replicate this picture, but it's there as a visual so that the words that I'm saying make some sort of sense to you. Now, you will know from previous courses, like even as far back as elementary school science, that cells have parts. If you remember back to grade 8, you would have learned about all these organelles, and then again in science 10. And so you hopefully know what DNA is, or you have a vague idea of what it is, maybe what it's made out of. Did any of you build a DNA model, maybe out of candy when you were in grade 9? Oh, when I was a grade 9 science teacher, we always built DNA out of candy. But DNA exists in each chromosome of a cell. So this first picture here is a picture highly magnified and very cartoony-ish of what DNA looks like. It's more like a model of DNA than actual DNA. Maybe you remember that DNA is made up of these pairs that match up with each other. Maybe you're like, oh yeah, I remember that from like grade 9 genetics when we talked about that. And if you don't, that's fine, because we will talk about the detailed structure of DNA in some of our future lessons. But DNA is the molecule of heredity, and it's in the chromosome of every cell. Now I've numbered these statements to kind of line up with the pictures here, so you get a sense of what we're looking at. In each of the pictures, we're zooming out a little bit farther. So the first picture is the most magnified, and as we move through the pictures, we're zooming farther and farther out. DNA is not normally easy to see. Most of the time, like in picture number 2, DNA exists as really long strands, which we call uncondensed DNA. Really long strands of uncondensed DNA called chromatin. And they are twisted around these little proteins called histones. So these little green tennis ball looking things, that's representing a protein. These are just modeling representations. This isn't like a microscope picture of what they actually look like, just to give you an idea. The blue line is the DNA. In the first picture, we were so zoomed in, we could see that DNA was made up of all these different parts. In the second picture, we've zoomed out so that this DNA just looks like one thing, and you can't distinguish that there's more than one part. Now, DNA in these long strands will have this region in the center. It's highlighted red on my picture just so that it stands out. It is not red in real life. In fact, your DNA is colorless in real life. It's very ugly. This is very pretty to look at. But it's called a centromere. And I just want you to notice condensed or uncondensed, chromatin, centromere. All of those words start with C. And there's more words that start with C later on. The letter C is like the letter of the day for this lesson. Did any of you watch Sesame Street as kids? Was that even still a thing? Is it even still on TV? I don't even know. It would be like a letter of the day every day on Sesame Street. Today's letter of the day is absolutely the letter C. Now that region in the center of each strand of DNA called chromatin is important because at some point during a cell's life, it's going to want to make a copy of itself, probably. And to make a copy of itself, it has to make a copy of all of its DNA. And so when an identical copy is made of a strand of DNA, we call it a sister chromatid. So in picture number 3, there was one strand. In picture number 4, see now there are 2 strands, and they are attached to each other by that middle piece, the centromere. So whenever we're going to make a copy of DNA, because the cell needs to make a copy of itself, it will be attached by the centromere. Now the last picture is what we call a condensed chromosome. see how the strands have all really compacted themselves and they've made this really beautiful X shape? This is when we can actually see DNA. It's really hard to see DNA in any of the other parts of its life, but when we've made a copy and it's been condensed, so the strands have all grouped up and formed this little X, you can actually see chromosomes. But for other parts of the cell's life, you can't. Now, would anybody like to ask any questions about this? Have any of you looked at DNA with a microscope before? Oh, well, super. We're gonna look at DNA with a virtual microscope, because our microscopes, they're not the greatest. But we're gonna look at DNA as it looks through a microscope in our class of Wednesday next week. So you're gonna get to see in real life, not just cartoony pictures, what this looks like. Now, the other word that's new today, it starts with a K, even though it probably could start with a C. In French, it starts with a C, and then it continues my C is the letter of the day theme, is the word karyotypes. A karyotype is an individual's collection of chromosomes. And you'll notice I wrote autosomes and sex chromosomes, and you're going to be like, what is that? Well, don't worry, I'm going to tell you down here what those are. Arranged by characteristics. Now, this particular picture is an example of a karyotype. It's not special in any way, it's just there to be a picture of it. You will not ever be asked to draw from scratch a karyotype, but you might be asked to look at one, okay? So I always think that's an important distinction to make. At no point will I ask you to draw something, and drawing is the only way that you can answer. You always could draw if you wanted to. Now, if we took one of your cells and looked at all of the chromosomes that you have, the easiest way to figure out what chromosomes you have would be to make a karyotype. We would take all your chromosomes and arrange them according to the 3 characteristics that I have there. Their size, and so by size, really we're talking length. I want you to notice that the longest chromosome is labeled number 1. Then number 2 is a bit shorter, 3, 4, 5. The longest ones go first, all the way to the shortest ones, which go last. The second thing that we arrange them by is their banding pattern. Now this one happens to have color on it because in real life we would use different colors to stain the chromosomes. When you do practice questions, it'll often just be a black and white picture, simply because it's easier to print and easier to see. But if you notice, the colors go in sort of different bands. That's to tell us which genes are on a particular chromosome. And you'll notice the 2 chromosomes that are in the number 1 spot have the same banding pattern. Where one's yellow, the other's yellow. Where one's red, the other is red. It's telling us that those chromosomes have the same genes on them. The third thing that we arrange them by is their centromere position. So sometimes you'll have 2 chromosomes that are about the same length. And you're like, oh, I don't know which one goes first, which one goes second. So we'll take a look where the centromere is. Now, on my first picture, I made it a red bubble so you could find it. In real life, it doesn't look like a red bubble. It looks like a pinched area. For example, in number 7, maybe you can see right here, it looks kind of pinched right there, like someone has squeezed it a bit. That's where the centromere is. Some centromeres are easier to see than others. Some of them aren't in the center. For example, chromosome 14 down here, the pinched part is very close to the top. So it does not have to be in the exact center of the chromosome. So far, I told you a bit about DNA and how it looks. Sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't. I told you what a karyotype is and how we organize it. Does anyone want to ask anything so far? Okay. So, if you look at this karyotype and you look at how many chromosomes there are, you'll see that every spot that's numbered has 2 chromosomes above it. They don't have an identical copy attached, so they haven't gone through cell division. But there are two chromosome number 1s. These two chromosomes are called homologous chromosomes. In fact, every pair of chromosomes, with the exception of one of them, would be called homologous chromosomes. Now, just to give you a bit of a preview of where we're going with this, we're going to talk about different types of reproduction, sexual reproduction being one of them. Anyone know how many parents biologically you probably have? And I say probably because we're getting to the point where this might not be the answer. Yeah, 2. You have 2 biological parents. And I say probably because if you look at new advances in technology, scientists have figured out ways for people to have 3 biological parents, but that's the future. But probably, I'm guessing most of you have 2 biological parents, which means that from your biological mother and your biological father, you got a copy of chromosome number 1. Mom gave one, dad gave the other. So you have 2 copies of each chromosome, 1 from each of your parents. However, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that your parents were not identical twins. If they were, that's kind of weird. But your parents probably do not have the exact same DNA. That means that these 2 chromosome number 1s, one from mom, one from dad, they're not identical, right? They're similar. It's the same chromosome. It's the same length, has the same centromere position, but it's going to carry slightly different information. So in the description of homologous chromosomes, they are chromosomes, like those 2 number 1s, that have the same genes at the same spots. Loci or locus is the fancy word of saying spot or position. I like to say spot because you know what that means, but you might run across the word loci or locus, especially if you choose a genetics topic as your de facto. But different alleles, which means version of the gene. So, for example, your mom and your dad, biologically, would have both given you a gene that helps determine the color of your hair. But maybe one of them had lighter hair and one of them had darker hair. They both had the hair color gene, but they had different versions of it. Now, does anyone have any questions they would like to ask about that? Okay, I would like someone to tell me in your own words what it means to be a homologous chromosome, what that means. Don't just read my definition. Tell me what you think homologous chromosome means. Oh, everybody, all at the same time. No one? No one wants to be brave? Take a chance? Yes, take a chance.
It's like they're the same kind of like type of chromosome, but it's like a different brand.
Yes, that is a good way of saying it. Same type of chromosome, different brand. Were you gonna say something?
No,
Okay. Now, in a karyotype, there are 2 types of chromosomes, which I mentioned up there, autosomes. I like to describe an autosome by saying it's not a sex chromosome. It's all the other ones. Autosomes, for humans, come in 22 pairs of homologous chromosomes. So if you look, number 1 is up here, and number 22 is way down here. It's the smallest pair. So you have 22 pairs of chromosomes. How many does that make total? Yes, you whispered it, but he said 44. There are 44 autosomes coming in 22 pairs. The very last pair, over here on the right, those are the sex chromosomes. Depending on biologically which sex a person is, you will have either 2 X chromosomes, which are called a homologous pair because they're the same chromosome, or, like in this picture I'm showing you, 1 X and 1 Y chromosome. Notice the X chromosome is very long and the Y chromosome is very short. The X and Y chromosomes are not a homologous pair. They have a very small section that is homologous, but as a whole, we do not call them a homologous pair. The sex chromosomes are always, 100% of the time, the last pair. Even though their size dictates that they should go elsewhere, they're always at the end. So if I ever ask you to look at a karyotype, sex chromosomes at the end. Now, I'm going to say this a lot because this is a hot topic. But whenever I talk about what sex a person is, I always mean biologically based on their chromosomes. There will be scenarios that we'll look at where people have different assortments of chromosomes than this. This is just the norm, but there are other ways that sex chromosomes can exist. And I'm not saying anything about gender identity. I'm only talking about chromosomal sex. Anyone want to say anything there? So, we also need to talk about how many. Oh, sorry, there was a question. Yes, you are. We also need to talk about how many chromosomes there are. Now, I asked you if there were 22 pairs of autosomes, how many chromosomes did that make? We said 44. If we add the 2 sex chromosomes, that makes 46. That's for a human cell. When cells have 46 chromosomes in humans, we call them diploid. If you look at the beginning of the word, it starts with di. And if you remember your Science 10 chemistry, di means 2. And so a diploid cell are cells that have 2 of each chromosome. Chromosomes in pairs. Now sometimes we'll say the word diploid. We'll say it's diploid. And that means there are 2 of each chromosomes, you have pairs. Sometimes though, we'll write what looks like a little algebra equation. And we'll write 2n equals 46, where the n represents how many chromosomes there are, and the 2 tells us there's 2 of each of them. So, most of the cells in your body are diploid. They have 46 chromosomes. Some cells, however, in your body will be haploid. Now, haploid doesn't sound like one of those prefixes you would have used in chemistry, but it does kind of sound like the word half if you just sort of say it quickly. Haploid. Haploid cells are cells that have unpaired chromosomes. So instead of having 2 of each chromosome, there's only 1. They're like half of a diploid cell. Now sometimes we'll just say the word haploid. Other times we'll write this little algebra piece here, and we'll just say n equals. N is how many chromosomes there are. And so in this case, for a human, n would equal 23. So what's that saying? It's saying you have 23 chromosomes. Most of your cells have a pair for each of them, but a very select few of your cells will have unpaired chromosomes. Does anyone have an idea which types of cells might only have 1 of each chromosome? You can take guesses. There'll be no penalty for wrong answers.
Sorry, what was the question?
My question was, do you have a guess at what type of human cells might only have 1 of each chromosome, might have unpaired chromosomes? So maybe think back to when I talked about how you have a mom and a dad, and maybe that will give you a clue. Yeah. Yeah. So which types of cells are these? Oh, my smartboard is not aligned. That's fun. Sperm and egg. I'm gonna have to fix that. Ooh. I hope I didn't write over that so that people can't read. But for humans, sperm and egg cells, which we call, oh, this is gonna be fun, gametes. Oh, I'm gonna write this on the whiteboard because that looks ugly. I'm gonna write it again. Gametes. 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 That's what we call the sperm and the egg cell. They are cells that would have unpaired chromosomes. And it makes sense because I'm going to put them together potentially to make a new human being. And so they can't have 46 chromosomes because when I put them together, then there'd be way too many. So sperm and egg cells are produced to have 1 of each chromosome, not 2, 1, so they can go together and make a pair. There are other types of cells, oh, this is fun, that are what we call polyploid. Does anyone remember what poly means as a prefix? It's coming from chemistry again, Science 10, long, long time ago. Yeah? multiple, many, several, more than a few. So poly means a bunch. How many exactly? It's not specifying. But cells that have multiple copies of each chromosome, we would call polyploid. For example, sometimes cells will be, 3N. That means instead of having having pairs of chromosomes, they have groups of 3. Now, there are no human cells that naturally exist that way typically, but there are some organisms where we might artificially induce this. For example, one of the ways that scientists have figured out to control fish populations, especially where they're breeding or farming fish, is to cause cells to be polyploid and have 3N chromosomes, and it makes it harder for the farmed fish to reproduce with the native fish of the area, so it's a breeding control system. There are some, especially aquatic organisms, that just naturally exist with 4N or with 8N, and so it's really species specific. Polyploid is not something you'll see a ton. You will see diploid and haploid most of the time. That'll be our main points of discussion, is those two. Now, if you remember the other day, I said that you need to be able to